This is the Venturing Angler Podcast. I'm Tim Harden. In this episode, we're talking with Aimee and Chase from Tight Loops about fly fishing travel, filmmaking, road trips, and more. Let's chat with Aimee and Chase. All right, we're here with Aimee and Chase from Tight Loops. Welcome to the Venturing Angler Podcast.
Hey, Tim. Great to be here.
So every time you guys have a video, I put it on the Venturing Angler. I love your work. I'm impressed with how much you do. But for those who aren't familiar, how would you describe just generally what Tight Loops is and who you are?
Firstly, I want to say thanks for being an OG supporter of Tight Loops, because you were putting our videos on the Venturing Angler long before we had the following that we do now, and our following is still modest. But when we were, absolute relative nobodies, you were on the support train early. So we really appreciate that. And I guess to sum it up, we're mostly, fly fishing focused filmmakers, but I think our work over the years has broadened from in the early days sort of being general kind of just fish porn documentation of fishing into larger, broader, more complicated subjects around nature, the outdoors, people, and conservation. So I'd like to think that our work now offers a lot more than just sort of casual sporting media, but I guess that's a pretty audience to decide. But I think we're certainly striving to tell bigger stories, although those stories still sort of originate from the seed of love of rivers and fish and fishing.
Where are you guys based?
It's kind of complicated because we live in our van, but technically we are based out of Montana.
Okay.
Yeah, we're technically based out of Butte, in that's where the vehicle is registered and our mail comes to. But that's just my folks' house. We don't have a home or an apartment with our name on it. We live full time, and currently our 1985 Volkswagen camper van. We're in the process of changing rigs, but currently we're still in the van, and we've owned that van for 7 years, and we did summers in it for about 3 or 4 years. And then made the call to just do that full time for the last 3 years, which coincidentally was timed like 6 months before a global pandemic, which suddenly made living in your van both ideal and incredibly scary and complicated.
Right.
But before that, we were on the East Coast. Amy's family is from the East Coast. My family's from Butte, but I went to college in Rhode Island. Amy's from Massachusetts. That's where I met her, and then we lived in a pretty sleepy suburban town called North Attleboro in Massachusetts for the first several years that we had that van, and we were making videos about us tripping around the West and stuff in that van. We were still located technically on the East Coast, but now we picked up and we shipped to Montana, although we're in Butte rarely because we live mobily, so we're all over the U.S.
That's cool. Yeah, I thought you guys were from the Northeast just because of some of your earlier videos, and then the Yellowstone flooding happened very quickly. Like, I was wondering if anything was going to be fishable that week, and then all of a sudden there were these, historic floods. And then a couple of days later, you sent me the video, and I'm like, how did they get here so fast?
Yeah.
So it's good to know that you're a neighbor.
It's funny, we were in Butte already staging for a project centered around the GYE. I don't want to get too much into the project because It obviously wasn't able to happen because of the flooding, but it was timed right here at the end of June into early July. Hopefully that'll happen next year, and then I'll have more to say about it then. But we were here sort of like getting stuff organized for a big project that's hard to organize literally from your van. So we were sort of using my parents' basement as a way to stage a bunch of gear and equipment for a big film project we were going to do. And then when the flooding happened, we knew that either that project was going to get canceled or at the very least was going to change because of what was happening. So we sort of rushed over there to see for ourselves and document it, knowing that like this is whether we want it or not, this is becoming part of our story in this project we're doing around Yellowstone. So yeah, it was not a happy accident, I guess isn't the right word, but it was an interesting coincidence that we happened to be in the area, and then this thing happened, and of course, we're filmmakers and we have all of our camera gear, and it's right in this area that we were focused on anyway. So we were able to capture that, and luckily that footage had a reasonably wide reach at the time when it was pertinent to have a wide reach, and we were able to direct people to relief efforts, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, our project that got canceled was sort of the least of humanity's worries in the Paradise Valley area,
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask where you went to school in Rhode Island?
Yeah, I went to the Rhode Island School of Design.
I knew it. See, that's
Yeah.
that's the only reason I asked, is because I had a suspicion.
Yeah, so top art school in the Northeast.
Yeah, and so I'd love to hear about your background, both of you, with art, filmmaking, photography. How did you come to where you are now as creators and professionals?
Do you want to start, Aimee?
Sure. Well, I guess my background is mostly in film photography. At age, like 12, 13, I was gifted a 35 millimeter camera from family members, and just got really into shooting film and black and white film, developing all my stuff at home. And then in high school, we had a crappy darkroom, and I was able to do some printing. And eventually I was like one of those art kids in high school that was like, I'm only going to art school, I don't need math and science. I was able to drop some of my math and science classes my senior year, and I did more work as like a teacher's assistant in our darkroom, which ultimately my teacher didn't really know much about developing film or printing film, so I sort of became like the guide for all of the other students in that class, and would spend most of my time mixing chemicals and hanging out there. So then ended up going to art school at Mass Art in Boston, and went for 1 year and dropped out, and just wasn't really like what I was looking for at that point in my life. Really didn't know like what I was doing, obviously, like directly out of high school. Just kind of looked at it as like, oh, you have to go to college. Moved down south for a little while, and was doing mostly like music, like live music documentation, and just taking pictures of friends and bands playing house shows. And I was part of like the punk music scene, I guess you would say. So kind of kept dabbling with photography through that process, and eventually moved away from it. And when I was in my first year of college, before dropping out, they had told me that I needed to buy a digital camera, which was like the bane of my existence, went against everything that I cared about with photography. So I, again, like dropped out, barely used the digital camera because I never ended up taking those classes. And fast forward years and years later, when I met Chase, still had the same camera and started shooting with it just sort of on a whim, and started to develop more of a connection to taking digital photographs, and just how much I could learn from that format. And then, yeah, Chase sort of was the introduction for video for me, because that was something I had never really worked with outside of like old video cameras, and the little cassette tapes, and just very, very minimal interaction with video work. So that was the first time I had really experimented with any of that, and then took off from there.
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, it's all image making. We're both visual artists, and Aimee started as a photographer when she was young, but she's also an illustrator and printmaker. They're all just sort of like different, multiple heads off the same snake, which is just trying to create. We're fine artists, we're visual artists, and my journey into filmmaking started as fine arts. I was an illustrator growing up. I mean, I don't know if you can call a kid an illustrator, but my interest was in illustration, and I sort of groomed myself from an early age. Like, I'm going to go to art school. I'm going to be an illustrator. Spend 10 hours a day drawing every day through all of grade school and middle school and into high school, and got accepted into RISD with an illustration based portfolio. But at the time, in sort of late middle school, early high school, I got really into skateboarding. And then I got quite good at skateboarding, and all my friends were getting quite good at skateboarding. And anyone who's familiar with skateboarding knows sort of at the center of the culture is skateboard videos. And I just happened to be the kid whose dad had a shoulder cam VHS camera, and wanting to imitate the pros that we all looked up to. We wanted to make our own skate videos. And I had the camera, and so I developed sort of a knack for filming because I was sort of a creative person anyway, but then also just by the nature. It seems like in every group of skateboarders, there's always just whatever kid had the camera ends up becoming the filmer of the group, And so by the time I was in college, I was doing that sort of semi-professionally, and I was out, till 2, 3 in the morning every school night filming professional skateboarders, and then trying to focus on illustration in school. I decided I should just consolidate my major and try and focus on one thing. So I decided the way art school works at most places, that the freshman year is sort of an introductory year where everyone has the same curriculum, and it spans sort of a gamut of arts, 2D, 3D, everything. And you declare your major sophomore year. So going into sophomore year, I decided to major in film, animation, and video. And that opened up a whole new world for me. It's interesting, if anyone's listening is into skateboarding or into skateboard videos, they're actually quite artistically progressive. You see a lot of pretty experimental filmmaking techniques in skateboard videos. So I had a great education already in film just from watching and making skate videos, but then getting a traditional classical training in college as a cinematographer really opened up that world. And then, my family's from Montana. It's in the blood. I grew up fly fishing. I sort of lost track of it a little bit in high school, and skateboarding and girls was the primary focus. But by the time I was in college age, and when Aimee and I met, I was starting to fly fish again a lot more and reconnecting with that. And at that point, calling myself a filmmaker is just sort of a matter of time before those subjects cross-pollinate, and we wanted to document the stuff we were doing anyway.
I love skateboarding videos. It's
yeah.
I'm trying to use a little self-restraint right now, because even though I've been involved in fly fishing filmmaking and obviously have an interest, and that's what you see a lot of on the Venturing Angler, when I'm watching things, it's surfing, skiing, climbing, skateboarding.
Right.
I don't know why. And it's funny. Did you see the new film, The Sanctity of Space?
I have not.
I'm familiar. Yeah, it just came out. Renan Ozturk. It's about Brad Washburn, the photographer, and Renan Ozturk talks about some of his first filming, and he used a fisheye lens because he thought it looked cool, because that's what you saw in skateboarding videos. And
there's a lens called the Death lens made by Century Optics that went on a Sony VX1000 for those who are listening and like skate videos. And I've had many of those lenses and many of those cameras over the years and smashed them all to bits skating.
That's funny. I'll move on from skateboarding in a second, but is there anybody that is a familiar name that you were able to film?
I became quite good friends, ironically, just because of where I went to college. He was opening up a skate shop at the time, with a sort of legendary East Coast professional skateboarder named Donnie Barley. I'll be dating myself by saying that Donnie Barley is sort of a legendary skateboarder. He really came up in the early to mid 90s. But anyone who knows skateboarding history and skate culture will have Donnie probably in there. Maybe not if it's not their Mount Rushmore top 4 or 5, probably like top 10 skateboarders of all time. And yeah, tons of other East Coast heads I could ramble on forever, but probably one of the more notable people would be Donnie for sure.
That's cool. That's really cool. I my only encounter, I think, with a legendary skateboarder, I moved to Campbell, California, and went to a skate shop to get something, and found out when I went in there that Steve Caballero lived in town. And I'm like, that's awesome.
Wow.
I used to have a Steve Caballero board. And so I called my brother that day and joked, and I was like, hey, Caballero lives in this town, and he and I are going to become friends today. And sure enough, I met him that day and was invited to his house to read the Bible.
Oh, wow.
I'm not kidding. And so one of his friends was like, you want to come over to Cab's house and read the Bible? And I'm like, sure. So
That's wild.
So I did. It was surreal because I'm in like his living room and there's all this Pal Peralta stuff everywhere. And
Yeah.
and I'm like, all right, well, I was joking that I was going to become friends with him. And we're not friends, but I sat in his living room and read the Bible with him.
Close enough. Yeah, close enough. It's actually, it's pretty interesting. Well, I mean, maybe it's just because it's our bubble. You know, honestly, Aimee and I met through skating. Aimee skates too.
Oh, cool.
But there seems to be a lot of crossover these days between skating and fishing. It seems like a lot of, I mean, fishing's getting more popular, skateboarding's getting more popular. Both have been for the last decade, but it seems like a lot of people who skate have found an interest in fly fishing in the last 5-10 years. We get reached anytime I post or we post anything about skating on any of our channels. Always a ton of people who follow us come out of the woodworks like, oh man, I didn't know you skate. Like I skate too, and it's just, yeah, it's weird. It seems like the worlds take to each other well. So like the same sensibilities that make people interested in skateboarding seems to keep people interested in fly fishing as well.
That's interesting. Yeah, I know a lot of snowboarders too.
Right.
Yeah. That's cool. Shoot. I had my mind focused on the direction this conversation was going to go, and now I'm thinking about like
Yeah.
Rodney Mullen and stuff. So, where did the interest, maybe because of your upbringing, Chase, in Montana, how did this turn into fly fishing?
Well, like I said, and I tell people who aren't from, especially when we were out on the East Coast, and you know, there's plenty of people who fish on the East Coast, but when you talk about fly fishing out there, there's probably more conventional anglers for the most part out east than fly anglers. So whenever I would talk to people about fly fishing, they'd be curious, oh, what's that? I'd be like, well, you know, I'm from Montana. You ever seen a river runs through it or whatever? Most people can connect with that. I'm like, it's like if you're from Brazil, like, yeah, you play soccer. Like everyone from Montana fly fishes, you know what I mean? Or at least 75% of their family fly fishes, whether they catch the bug in a serious way or not. It's just sort of ingrained in the culture. So I don't really feel like I had a say in the matter. You know, all my uncles and cousins and my grandfather were all fly anglers. So by the time I came of age as an angler, which is like 5 or 6 years old, family vacations was just like, what are all the men doing? Like they're all going fly fishing, like get in the truck or whatever. So that's what brought me there. I think in terms of what kept me there is just sort of my sensibility as a person. It's the same reason I ended up in the arts. I'm just sort of a quiet and thoughtful person, you know, and it's beyond cliche at this point, but fly fishing is certainly sort of like the quiet man's pastime, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. It's fun. It's funny. I'm from the East Coast too, and when you bring up fly fishing, some people give you kind of a puzzled look.
Right.
And then you're like, river runs through it. You're right. So that evolved into quite the passion, at least if you didn't have it already for both of you, because you know I don't actually. I was going to say I take a lot of road trips. I don't now that I'm in Montana, but before Montana, I was, You know, I felt like I was always on the road, but I'm a little hesitant to say that to you guys because of how much you travel. You know,
Yeah.
you have videos of everywhere from Maine to Arizona, and one of the things I love about your films is um, it like doesn't they don't check any boxes. In fly fishing film, once you see something, you see like five other people doing the same exact thing, and
Right.
it drives me nuts. And I really badly want to use some examples right now to show you, like, you know, to express the
Right.
point that people can be
Yeah.
really unoriginal.
Yeah.
But
Oh no.
everything about what you do is original, and so it's coming from something of your own creativity, your own interests. What is that?
Well, first, thanks. I mean, I really appreciate it. We like to think that, what we're doing is different, but it means something different when someone else says it, as opposed to you just being, no, I swear we're different. But I think it's because we come to it sort of as outsiders. There's a lot of people in any genre, um, sports filmmaking or any type of filmmaking, who maybe grew up watching that format and got interested in filmmaking from that format. I mean, that's certainly true. Like for me, um, like I said, my journey into filmmaking came because I was a skateboarder, and skateboarders religiously consume skateboard videos, and so then I wanted to make skateboard videos. Um, I think that's true of fly anglers too. Probably a lot of people growing up these days who are watching fly fishing media get their first camera because they want to make fly fishing videos. And when you've consumed a sort of narrow window of content and ideas, you're probably more likely to regurgitate those same ideas. And so we didn't, we enter it as filmmakers stand alone before making fly fishing films. So our pedigree and interests in cinema and filmic storytelling are far broader than just fish stories. And like I said, when we started, we essentially dabbled, trying to figure out the format of what makes a fishing story. We dabbled in the sort of traditional ways of doing that, but we just have a lot of tool sets to draw from in terms of storytelling and filmmaking. And I think a lot of those tools come from places way outside of fly fishing. So I think that probably has an impact on the work at the end of the day.
The destinations you choose are not the normal destinations, especially, I mean, you're from Butte. You could easily, you know, go to all the big Western rivers, but I learn
Right.
about new places from your videos. How do you, how do your trips come into fruition? Like what, you know, Arctic Char in Maine is a good example, right? Like
Right.
when I'm sitting around with other filmmakers, that conversation does not happen.
Right.
And so how do you guys get there and then bring forth this great new fresh unique content?
Yeah, I guess the thing is that our interest as people, while certainly fishing is like I don't even want to say a primary focus. It's a big driver. We love fishing and we love the outdoors, and fishing takes you to interesting places we love to see, even if we aren't fishing. So it's certainly a motivating factor in deciding where we're going is based around fishing, but also, we have such interest in the outdoor and wild spaces that doesn't have anything to do with fishing. Like we just got back from a pack rafting trip in Wyoming with some friends, and like we packed a fly rod and like barely used it. We were just hiking and rafting. So like we're not so hyper focused on fishing that our trips are dictated by it. It's kind of more like we're interested in just exploring the country and figuring out what fishing opportunities might be along the way. And I think that oftentimes will lead you to interesting places you wouldn't have thought or come up with if you were just sort of like researching like the best places to catch big fish. or whatever. Not that, the old adage that trout don't live in ugly places. It's kind of hard to go wrong anywhere in the country when you're searching out, wild areas with fish. But and in particular,
and certainly like searching for native fish has brought us to a lot of places that I don't think either of us thought we would have been fishing, like in Arizona, and
right,
it's exposed us to a lot of new places for us too.
Right. In particular, the sort of recent stuff, like you're talking about the Arctic char or like Apache trout in Arizona, is really centered around this sort of year we did in 2020, leading into 2021, which is a series that we're working on called For Wild's Sake. The whole series is shot. It's taking us forever to edit and get everything rolled out from it, to the point where like the episodes are 2 years back from when we shot them, just because we're putting so much effort into this series with all sorts of moving parts and research and interviews with people. And I don't know, it's just become a much bigger production than we thought it was. And our manpower is very small because it's just us. But the point of that trip, or that series, is focused on rare native salmonids in North America. And it just so happens that rare fish are rare because they've been pushed to the fringes of habitat in the U.S. And the fringes happen to be some really interesting and wild places, So it's not so much that we're like, oh, what would be like the craziest place to go, and we end up there. You're just sort of following the story of the last bastions of truly wild, untouched space in the US, and those places are incredible.
Yeah. One of the things that's interested me from your work recently is the pursuit of these native fish. And the locations get my interest too, because, despite the fact that for so many years I sit and focus on destinations over and over and over again, I am learning about new ones from you all. Where did this interest in finding the native wild fish come from?
Well, I think it's an extension of the interest in wild space, in the natural world in general. I think it's often talked about how fly fishing leads to greater understanding of ecology and wildlife, simply by the merits of the sport itself. You're using lures that imitate insect life. You have to start thinking about the food web. You're fishing for cold water species that are temperature dependent. You start thinking about temperature of water and what causes water to heat up or cool down. You can't, it's almost impossible to remain as focused as just like, I drive to the pond, I cast, I catch a bass, I go home. You're forced into thinking about larger ecological concepts, purely based on the way the sport is practiced. But even beyond that, you get into the fish and the food web, and then if you're interested in the larger history of the animal, and then you start thinking about the history of its interaction with people and people on the landscape and the landscape itself, you can just start branching off sort of indefinitely. Nature is so complicated in its fractal like webs that the limits to how far you can explore and how much you can learn is essentially just like limited to your motivation and interest. And we just happen to be very curious, motivated people. So in just fishing for trout in general, you start asking questions about, well, what is this thing that I'm spending all this time chasing after? Where did it come from? Why is it here? You start learning about, oh, weird, this thing doesn't, I'm here fishing some tailwater in Montana for brown trout, and what, brown trout are from Europe?
Right.
Like, how'd they get here? What was here before brown trout? And then, naturally, I think our interests, because we're sort of people who are interested in the natural world first, anglers second, as opposed to anglers first, who have like a budding interest in the natural world, but really it's focused on angling. For me at least, my journey into angling is just out of an interest in being connected to natural cycles in some way. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people, even if they can't articulate it in that way. All that stuff about stress relief, etc., that comes from fishing, I think is just because people are happy to be connected to natural systems. And when you're talking about natural systems, I always gravitate towards what makes for healthy and intact natural systems. And if you're going to have that conversation, you can't really have it without talking about native species, which is sort of what led us there.
Yeah. As you've traveled and had so many different and such a variety of different experiences, has anything stood out as especially memorable, or are there any trips in particular that really stood out for you?
I feel like that's a tough one. There's been so many trips. I mean, the first one that comes to mind for me, first of all, like fly fishing was not in my family. So fly fishing was pretty new to me, introduced to by Chase, and I had been vegetarian like for 12 years at that point. Fishing was totally not on my radar as something I was even interested in trying or doing, but I met Chase and went fly fishing with him, and he showed me a little bit about how everything worked and explained the flies, and I started catching just like local stocked fish, and really fell in love with it. And I think more so than just catching the fish, it was an excuse to be immersed in nature. And then fast forward, like us going out to Montana for the summers in our van, and Chase convinced me to go on this hike. I'm pretty paranoid about bears. Growing up on the East Coast, only having black bears, the thought of grizzly bears is pretty tough for me. But I've been working on it. I've been getting better. But this is years ago. I mean, I guess at this point, almost 7 years ago. But we hiked up to a lake in Montana, and Chase did not tell me about the grizzly bear activity that was up there. And we caught golden trout, and it was an absolutely fantastic overnight. And he proposed to me the next morning.
Nice.
At our camp spot. So that was a pretty memorable trip for the fish, for the overnight hiking. I mean, it was a pretty difficult hike for me at the time, and obviously a pretty important life moment.
You said yes.
So that was pretty, yes. pretty memorable. But there's just been so many.
That's how you got to do it, guys. Just trap your wife to be top of a mountain.
I was like not totally convinced that this was a great idea, that we were going to do this, but it ended up being all right. We made it out alive. But yeah, I think constantly, like all the trips that we take and the beautiful places we get to experience, they're all really memorable in their own ways, and it's hard to pick one. I mean, we've had so many incredible opportunities. We've been up to northern Canada catching salmon, which is something that I completely did not understand, like how that was so appealing to people until I caught one, and it was just immediately enthralled and like totally hooked. So I think it's been an experience, a new experience in so many different places, but also like the growth and the learning that's always happening with those experiences is very memorable too.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of the stuff in the desert has been really memorable for me. I think you get an idea, a preconceived notion or assumption about what trout habitat is and what trout fishing would look like. But as you explore a little bit deeper and you start getting into the fringes or the exceptions to the rules, stuff like, these Apache trout in Arizona, that you're basically driving through the Sonoran Red Rock Desert, and then you just hit these like small little mountain islands with scrubby little pine trees, and you climb up, and all of a sudden you're in alpine meadows and there's elk and these tiny little streams running from snowmelt and springs, and these just such isolated little patches of habitat in the desert Southwest with cold, clear water and these super unique fish. Those are really memorable for me because they really challenge not only my notions about what trout rivers were like, but also just what the landscape in the U.S. was like. I think before we started visiting the Southwest, we sort of had this idea of what a state like Arizona looked like, and it was, red and hot and dry and barren. And now we've spent so much time in and around that area, and there's such a varied habitat, and also spending a little more time just in the desert in general. What may have seemed like sort of a barren place is actually just like exploding with life if you slow down and take the time to look. So those have been really memorable, and I'm looking forward to more moments like that where I'm blown away by something that I had sort of written off, because I think we're all guilty of doing that sometimes. And if you're lucky like we are, and you've managed to build a life that affords you the luxury to spend time traveling and exploring these types of places, there's just like so much. You just have your mind blown like once a week or once a day, every day.
Yeah. You mentioned wanting to do more. Do you guys have plans for what's up next?
Well, yeah.
We always have plans.
There's always plans.
There's always something in the works.
So for the series, for Wild's sake, like I said, it's all shot. We're just getting through the editing, and I think we've released 6 episodes that has covered 3 different species of fish. And there's a couple episodes that don't cover fish at all. I mean, yeah, you want to talk about how like our work is different within the fly fishing space. Like, how about a fishing show that has like an hour worth of content where not a single fish is seen?
No, it's not for everybody.
It's for the curious nature lover who has a propensity for angling. I think there's something in there for everyone. But so that series, we've got like 7 or 8 more fish species that we covered then, and probably another 10 episodes or something to get through that. I wish I had an answer for how long it's going to take to finish that, but honestly, probably by the time we're done, the series start to finish will have been like a 3 or 4 year project.
Yeah, Chase does all of the editing, coloring, sound design, like top to bottom, everything on his own in the post production.
On my laptop in a van.
A lot.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it takes a long time. I'm sure our aspirations and our goals are to make films that look like they were made by large production houses, when in reality we only have the resources to do it ourselves on our laptops, and which is all well and good. You can totally do that. It just takes a really long time. I'm doing motion graphics work and stuff where I'm spending like 2.5 days getting like a 4.5 second map animation done for one piece in an episode, and that's just sort of like the pace of the whole series is how long it's taking. We're doing better now than we were 5 years ago, but anyone who's making fly fishing films for a quote unquote living knows there's not like a ton of money in it, unless every now and again you score like a really big job with a big client like Patagonia or something who can like really fund the nuts and bolts of something. But for the independent filmmaker, for the most part, you're making a little bit of money here and there, enough to keep it going, but like you can't hire out 10 people to help you with a project unless those people are interested in doing it for gear trades or whatever. So we're just doing the work of like 20 people as 2 people, so it's taking forever. So anyway, sorry, roundabout way of getting to people who are watching our stuff. That's sort of what will continue to roll out for the next 6 months, a year, but that was 2 years ago. So a lot of stuff has happened since then. A lot of it, a lot of canceled plans, as anyone I'm sure who had a bunch of international fishing plans or whatever knows, for the last 2 years, 2.5 years now. A lot of stuff has gotten canceled. Even this summer, well, obviously the thing we were talking about with Yellowstone got canceled, but we were supposed to go to Mongolia in the fall. That's recently fallen through. We're heading to Canada in like a week and a half. We're going to be working on a documentary film up there about a family who's got a lease on a river that they describe as sort of the most unique brook trout river in all of northern Canada, and that it's like a western walk and wade style brook trout river with giant brook trout, which is sort of unheard of up there. Anyone who knows much about brook trout fishing in Quebec and Labrador know that it's kind of like big lakes fished with boats and outlets and stuff. It's not not really like a walk several miles and fish the riffles kind of landscape. So they have this really unique spot up there. They used to have a lodge on almost 20 years ago, and it's been closed since then. No one's been there. No one's fished it in 20 years. And they're thinking about reopening it and also getting their family together to fish it together. And their family, being as busy as they are, haven't really all been together at one point like that in as long as since that place has been closed. So
Okay.
we're there to document this story about this family and about this place. And we'll be up there for 3 weeks. So we're pretty excited about that. That's like that's been getting pushed every year
Yeah,
for like
that's
the
2
last
years
for the
in
last
the
2 or
works.
3 years. And it looks like it's finally happening. And so yeah, that's definitely next. And then we have this For Wild's Sake Rare Trout Chronicles thing. We still got a ton of species to cover, but we just like because we're so far behind the 8 ball editing, we just had to cut it off at some point and be like, whatever this is, a season or whatever we're calling it, like we just got to get this done before we keep tackling that. But we don't have any plans to get off the road anytime soon. Like I said, we're looking at switching rigs, but we're still going to be full-time on the road, full-time traveling. So if I can get this all done, there'll probably be a season 2 with a bunch new fish and new places, hopefully riding the coattails of the success of this series, maybe a little more funding behind it, maybe we'll be able to hire some people, maybe we'll be able to get it out in a more timely fashion. But yeah, there's always something that's next. I mean, we're always dreaming up something, and hopefully more bigger adventures in the country and out of the country. It's just for the last couple of years, big adventures have been really hard to plan and follow through on.
Yeah. Mongolia would be a pretty big one.
Yeah, we were really, really excited for that. It was going to happen last May, and then it didn't, and then maybe last fall, and then it didn't, and then this May, and then it didn't, and then this fall, and now it didn't, and now we're looking at next May. So we'll see. Maybe next.
It's not off the table, but we're just trying to temper expectations, I guess.
Mongolia in particular has been really complicated because they had very, very strict COVID restrictions, which kept it very hard for Westerners to travel in the country for the last couple of years. And then the people who are organizing the trip, who are researchers out there, we'd be following a group of researchers doing some really cutting edge research on taimen in some places that Westerners traditionally have not been allowed to go. So some pretty spectacular landscapes, etc. The people organizing that have fallen on some tough health issues, surgeries, back surgeries, knee surgeries, which has just put it off the table. So now that the traveling restrictions are off, we're just trying to get everyone healthy and good to go, but hopefully next year.
Yeah, that'd be great. I was interested in you talking about natural things, and it's true. You catch a brown trout in Montana, it comes from Europe. You catch a rainbow trout in Argentina, and it comes from California,
Right.
or a brown trout from Europe. And it's a lot of the fisheries are that way. When I imagine with the ethic that you have, that you're often thinking about environmental issues and various ecological issues, and some of those might really be at the forefront of your mind. What, for you both, are you concerned about or interested in with respect to environmental issues as you've traveled?
Gosh, well, I think if I have one message about the natural world and people, I guess you call that our world, is that one, I'm a firm believer that people need the natural world to function properly and be happy and healthy. I think, oftentimes the conversation is very about the nature, about the environment in terms of what's good for the environment I don't know if I'm articulating myself right here. Like it's like people exist in a separate space, and people will be fine no matter what, boarded away in their concrete cities. But the real concern is like what's going to happen to nature and the animals, if their habitat is lost, and climate change, et cetera, et cetera. I think oftentimes left out of the conversation is the fact that what's bad for nature is bad for us too. I don't think that I don't think it's safe and sustainable for us to board ourselves within artificial walls and, whatever, fly to Mars and we'll be fine.
Right.
So I think the two are inextricably connected. And I think what we know, I say we, what the scientific, ecological, environmental community at large knows now and seems to be more and more at the forefront of the different management strategies, is that essentially nature regulates best when left to do what nature does naturally. So when it comes to things like artificial, man-made, or human-influenced fisheries, even like Montana's one of the gold standards of fishery management, in that all the moving water in the state here isn't managed entirely as wild trout fisheries. We don't stock the streams and rivers here. They're still wild but invasive species that are here for the most part. The native trout, they're predominant in Montana. West Slope cutthroat are in like 3% of their historic range or whatever. And I think the more we know about natural systems, the more we realize we don't know anything, and that it's so much more complicated than we could have ever fathomed. And that something as simple as like one trout versus another trout aren't equivalent to each other. And these things have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in immeasurably complex ways to be perfect interlocking puzzle pieces within a giant system. So if we know anything about the workings of man on natural systems, it's that whether intentional or not, we don't have the processing power to even comprehend the ripple effects of us messing with things. So I think the sort of primary focus or message in our work, and it's not unique to our work, but it's certainly in our work, is that to be the best stewards of the environment, we have to sort of get out of its way. And unfortunately, we've spent, here in the Western US, 200 years messing with stuff up to this point. So a huge part of the conservation, outdoor environmental movement these days is just trying to like put as much back as we can, because I think people at large had the hubris to think that we could manipulate and alter the environment to our advantage. And slowly we're learning what may have seemed like an advantage at the beginning, protracted over time, has turned out to be disastrous in a lot of ways. So we're just trying to turn back the clock now, try and set as many things back as we can. And some things will never be, or at least for what we know now, or can even conceive of tools, can never be changed. The Madison will never be a cutthroat fishery ever again. It's too, I don't want to say it's too far gone. It's a beautiful river and a wonderful fishery, and you're not a sinner for enjoying it. It's an incredible place, as are all these rivers in Montana. But there's no turning back the clock, or not even on the horizon in sight, a way that we could ever conceive of a way to rid a system that large and complex of invasive trout and replace it with native trout. So some things can't be changed, but there are areas of opportunity, these smaller headwater streams that still have intact native ecosystems, trying to protect those places and keep them from being engulfed by some of the mistakes of the past. And, you know, that stuff's really controversial amongst anglers because, well, fishing is fun and people love fish, and brown trout are beautiful and rainbow trout are amazing sport fish. And someone who's, you know, a lot of these ideas, they're not new ideas, but they're certainly gaining in popularity, and they weren't nearly as popular when a lot of people may have started fishing several decades ago. And you're, in supporting a lot of these ideas about native fish conservation, you're sort of threatening people's ideas about fishing or livelihood. You know, if you start talking about, oh, we got to, you know, eradicate invasives and replace them with native fish, guides on the big hole are getting cagey about people rote noning out all the brown trout or whatever, you know. But I don't think that's realistically the goal of most native fish advocates, because everyone knows, like I said, there's some things we can never turn back the clock on. But yeah, that's kind of a long, convoluted answer.
No, and your comments made me think of two ideas. One is a quote that's at least attributed to John Muir, which is, "When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to everything else in the world."
Right.
And the other is an idea that the Pope, and I never talk about religion, I don't think, on the podcast, but he says he prefers, and it's in part for religious reasons, but he prefers the term creation over nature, because the way we talk about nature is as if it's separate from us. And I'm guilty of this all the time. Like I'll say like, oh, I think I'm gonna, you know, get in the car and go do something in nature. Well, nature isn't like, you know, up Highway 80 in the Sierras. It's like we're in it, like we're part of it, and so, like you said,
it's a really difficult subject to breach sometimes, because on the one hand, the instinct may be, geez, you know, everything people touch gets ruined. You know, you hear this a lot from, you know, stringent environmentalists, like the best thing you can do. And even sort of the way I'm talking about, like, nature works best when left alone, almost sort of gives this implication of like, don't touch it, don't look at it, stay away from it.
Don't enjoy it.
Yeah, don't leave your house, you know, like just let the animals be over there. That's their environment. And like, we live here where people live, you know. But I think, and while there's obviously ideas in there that are really important about, because our population is so large and our wild spaces are so small comparatively, about use and volume of human activity, and, you know, we're high impact species. So all that's still true. We do have to be careful about how we interact with the natural world in order to protect it. You're right that it does sort of, talking about it that way breeds a intellectual separation between people and the natural world, which I think does a disservice. Because if people think of humans as one thing and nature as another thing, it doesn't feel like our thing. And when it's not our thing, people are less likely to take ownership over it. You know, if it's your neighbor's house versus your house, you're going to take better care of your house than worrying about your neighbor's house. I think it's important to remember that we do belong here. People are a part of the natural world. We're supposed to be a part of the natural world. It's okay to interact tangibly with the natural world. I feel really conflicted about a lot of that stuff. Obviously, we're both big proponents of like leave no trace ethic, etc. But sometimes I see the direction that those types of ethics can lead to, and it's almost like, well, what's the conclusion here? Like, we should just never go outside, you know, because you might have some impact. Which, you know, that's something that comes up, of course, in fishing all the time, right? Because you start throwing around these ideas about like low impact and low impact tackle, and what's the keep them wet, and what's the best way, what's healthy for fish. And like, well, I think we all know the best thing for fish would probably be not hooking them by the face and dragging them across the water into your net all the time, you know. But how could something that like brings such like joy and sense of purpose to people be the wrong thing to do for people? You know, it's complicated stuff. And I think once you start thinking and talking about this stuff, you can like really wrap your head in knots. But I think, yeah, at the end of the day, people belong outside. It's okay to be outside. You shouldn't walk around with this heavy guilt about man-made climate change and habitat degradation, et cetera, and impact all the time. It's a fine line between being conscious of that stuff and sort of self-flagellating or whatever.
Yeah. No, that's good. It's true. And it's hard because even when you go fishing, which for me connects me to the natural world and gives me an appreciation for nature more than anything. I'm also like driving my big truck and stuff like that. So
right.
It's
right. I think, at the end of the day, what's important to remember is there is no eliminating impact in life with anything. To exist is to interact with the world, and interaction has effects. It's like the Demure quote about pulling on the string. We can't not pull on strings. The only way to not pull on a string is to not exist. Inevitably, by just opening up the door and walking outside, you're beginning to pull on strings. Yeah. And that's normal and that's natural. Everything is pulling on some string somewhere that's having an effect. Even in healthy, intact ecosystems, there's entropy, there is predation, there is impact. Deer trample wildflowers too when they go quote unquote off trail, right? And we accept that as normal behavior. We look at everything that we do as people as sort of unnatural behavior. Again, this sort of separation between people and nature. But again, yeah, I don't want to encourage people to just go running off trail everywhere and trampling sensitive areas that are high impact and high traffic. But at the same time, yeah, I think we need to be accepting of the fact that we will have impacts, and we all just have to decide what level of impact is acceptable for us. For some people, something like catch and release fishing is not an acceptable impact. For some people it is. I don't think there's a right answer there, because right alongside all this other stuff, people have evolved to be on the landscape too. And for better or worse, people have been bugging fish for thousands of years. It's right. Part of being a person.
Yeah, and if you have a field of tomatoes, you're displacing animals, and so it's there's just always some sort of compromise, I guess.
Yep, and you're harvesting, killing life forms, and eating them, and the whole thing. I think that people want answers. Feeling like you're having an impact that causes death or suffering or perceived destruction in some way is troubling to people, because we anthropomorphize things and we look at them in terms of the way we view our own worlds and our own lives. But those things are inevitable. There is no way to remove yourself from the equation, like I said, other than to not exist. So yeah, coming to terms with the equations there and our impact on it. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's part of the wonderful thing about being alive on planet Earth, traveling through space, is how complicated and confusing all this stuff is.
Aimee?
Yeah. I feel like I never have a lot to say on this subject because Chase says so much of it so eloquently.
No, that was great.
I don't have a lot to add, but
no, there's nothing worse than being like a round table, about like a book or something, and everyone's like, what do you think this is about? And you're like the eighth person, and you're like, No, I mean, Chase, that was phenomenal, and Aimee, I laughed when I looked to you next, because that was such a contribution to the answer that I didn't.
Yeah, it's predominantly sort of my wheelhouse, and it's also just sort of a difference in the type of people that Aimee and I are. I come from a particular background in that my dad's an academic, and intellectual pursuits and rambling are sort of like ingrained in me. It's part of the way I interact with the world. I think Aimee's far more intuitive than I am. I'm just known to like beat everything to death intellectually. I just can't help myself.
I think I'm more of I have a lot of these conversations internally with myself, more than like with other people, whatever. I don't know, whatever.
I
have, but I think about it, but I don't necessarily like articulate it.
Yeah, I have to articulate things. Aimee feels things. It's good. It helps us complement each other.
Yeah, that's good. I think I feel the things and I find quotes from John Muir and the Pope, and that's how I articulate it.
Yeah. I have a hard time putting a lot of those feelings into words, I think.
But you can see it in your work, especially with what you guys emphasize and focus on. And like you said, you can watch a lot of one of your films before you see any fishing. And so it, there's a lot being communicated there for sure.
Yeah, I think, there's a push or a pull maybe when you're making any sort of media of any kind to want to like appeal to an audience, and probably that's a lot of what you're saying, the fly fishing format, and this could be true in formats of any type of filmmaking. There's a lot of like monotony, a lot of tropes that get repeated, and I think a lot of that is people just trying to sort of fulfill an expectation they think is there for what a film needs to be, or a story needs to be, or their media needs to be, etc. But we've always just been more interested in wanting to make the kind of stuff that we would like to see, and we as people are just sort of curious people, and our curiosity doesn't begin and end with fly fishing. We've carved out a space sort of in the fishing world, so most of our stories, we're not quite at the point yet where we're just putting out like full-blown hiking films. There's always usually some sort of a thread of angling or fish within the story, but yeah, our interests are broad. So I'm interested in broader stories, so we've just decided to try and make broader stories. And I think, a year or two into making fishing stories that were just really focused on fishing as creative and curious people, you kind of like, you see the limitations of that format. Like, how many different ways can I tell the story of like, here's this fish we want to catch, we went, it was hard, we caught it, we celebrated. Yeah, there's only so many ways that you can tell that story, and we just sort of got to a point where we were feeling like, I don't really want to tell this story over and over again, because it just doesn't stimulate me creatively.
Well, there's also so many other things that are going on that we like to focus on as well in the bigger story about that adventure. And yeah, I guess.
And luckily we've built this life where we're pretty poor, but we've got like just enough money to like play as much as we want and work as little as we need to keep the whole thing going. We don't really have a backup nest egg or anything. If things really turned south, we'd probably be in a lot of trouble really quick. But like, so far, we're not rocking the boat too much, and we're able to just keep making this stuff. And the luxury that affords is that we don't feel a pressure to have to fulfill any expectation other than our own. And we can sort of just pursue our own creative whims to whatever extent we want to pursue them, which gives us a lot of freedom to just sort of like tell the stories that stimulate us and that are interesting for us, the rabbit holes that are fun for us to go down, and not have to worry about like, boy, if this doesn't perform well, we're not going to have gas in the tank next week, which is big for an artist. That's like the most liberating thing. That's what every artist wants, is just to be like comfortable enough to pursue whatever creative whim they have. And we're doing our best at it. We're doing all right. We feel the stress of money all the time. And maybe if we like shifted gears and went just like full fish porn dubstep, like video a week on YouTube, like maybe we could grow this outfit a little bit bigger, a lot quicker. But
there's a balance for sure.
Yeah, it's just not as rewarding. So we're still testing out the system of like, do it for the love, and we've been doing that for over half a decade, 7-8 years now. It hasn't quite gotten old yet. And luckily things are sort of, they've been on a slow burning up and up. So we're hoping to just be able to keep doing that forever, as long as we're motivated to do it.
Well, thanks for not beating these cliches to death that, the hero's journey of catching a fish, you leave home, you catch the fish, and everyone's changed forever kind of thing. And then, of course,
and listen, there's a place for that stuff.
It happens.
Yeah, people aren't wrong for feeling inspired. If that's the kind of content you like, it's great. There's so much of that content that the world isn't being served by us making more of it. There's plenty of people who do that super well, and there's lots of forums to see that type of content. So yeah, doesn't need to us too.
And don't get me wrong, I've had that experience. However, if that's always the formula for a film, it's, and then the other one, of course, is, we're taking this amazing adventure, Jacques Cousteau style, then the people show up at a lodge that
right
was built in like 1973.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm mentioning these cliches is you guys really get away from that, and I love it. And I'm sure that a lot of listeners are familiar with your work, but for those who aren't, where would you point them to go to see and learn more?
Well, the immediate place to see films, because we do a lot more other than just filmmaking. I think most people know us primarily as filmmakers, is our YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/tightloops, or just search Tight Loops on YouTube, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. Our branding is a little confusing in that on Instagram we're Tight Loops Fly, and our website is tightloopsfly.com, and that really just is because we had a tussle with some casting instructor lady in New England who owns tightloops.com, is not using it, but just owns it just in case one day she'll need to use it and refuse to sell it to us.
Turns out it's a phrase that's popular enough that people went out and bought it. So
when we first started this whole whatever brand, art collective, whatever it is,
we didn't know what it was going to be. It all just kind of happened.
We wanted tightloops.com. We call ourselves Tight Loops. So a lot of people know us as Tight Loops Fly, because when we couldn't get the website, and the website had to be Tight Loops Fly. And then there's also like 20 people on Instagram who have different versions of just Tight Loops that all have like 2 followers or whatever. So we had to get Tight Loops Fly also. So Instagram and website is Tight Loops Fly. YouTube is just Tight Loops. We were lucky to get that one on YouTube, but that's the nearest place to get like directly into watching films. But we do other stuff. Aimee's a fantastically talented photographer, so you can see her work on our website and on our Instagram. If you're a consumer of fly fishing media, every so often you'll see articles that Aimee's photographed and I've written in various fishing publications. We don't have anything coming out in the immediate sense, but you might see some of our, the written word that way. And I'm also a fine artist, as I talked about earlier, and that practice recently has sort of led me to down a very focused field of scientific illustration of fish, which people would probably be familiar with that type of format from just looking in fishing regulation or fishing guidebooks, sort of standard side view of fish done in hyper realistic, true to life detail. That's a genre that I'm really interested in, and the series for Wild Sake that we've been talking about with the rare fish is sort of centered around our travels to find specimens for me to illustrate. So also on my website, or on our website, there's paintings, some originals when they're around, but they go pretty quick, but also fine art reproduction prints of all those different species and other ones over the years. So for art enthusiasts, that's another forum that you can interact with our work in, and that you can own prints of these paintings that I make.
Excellent. Well, I'm thrilled that you guys came on, and I appreciate the conversation. Thank you. And as always, as I have been for quite some time, I'm always looking forward to what's next from you, and keep up the great work.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, we really appreciate you having us on. And again, can't thank you enough for all the support over the years. We're big fans of what you do and of the Venturing Angler, and yeah, we're honored that we've been supported so much over the years, and we're honored to be on here. And it was great to finally meet in pseudo person and phone land
right.
and chat. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I'm sure I'll see you around Montana soon.
Yeah, just a matter of time before we run into each other now that we're closer together. So.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thanks, guys, and looking forward to more.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so everyone for listening.